Erica, Sara, welcome. This year's Peacebuilding Week marks 20 years since the creation of UN Peacebuilding Architecture. Why is this milestone important, and what does it tell us about the role of peacebuilding today? Erica first.
Right. So a lot of the things that we think about that are part of the Peacebuilding Architecture, the Peacebuilding Commission, the Peacebuilding Support Office, the Peacebuilding Fund, which finances a lot of peacebuilding activity, they were created in 2006. And take a step back and think what was happening then. Why were these created? So throughout the 1990s, we had had success as an international community in ending a lot of long-running civil wars in places like Angola, in Cambodia, in El Salvador, in Sierra Leone, and in Liberia. But in many of these conflicts, even though there was an initial peace deal, that wasn't enough to sustain the peace. There were still conflict drivers. They were sometimes interconnected between these different countries. And so what the Secretary General at the time and others who were working in the peacebuilding field decided was that you needed that connective tissue between an immediate conflict response and how you were able to sustain and actually transform conflicts. The Security Council is often seized with that immediate conflict response moment. It might commission a peace operation. It might be engaged itself in some of the mediation alongside the Secretary General. The General Assembly and the ECOSOC are often concerned with some of the longer term trends, human rights, economic drivers, things like that. But what is the connective tissue in between those? And it's exactly for that reason that they decided to create a peacebuilding commission and this broader peacebuilding architecture that could kind of keep their eyes on making that transition from immediate conflict to long-term peace.
Sara, this is the first year that we have been having Peacebuilding Week. Where did the decision to create this annual event come from, and why was it seen as necessary?
So, as Erica was saying, when the peacebuilding architecture was created 20 years ago, part of that architecture was undergoing what's called the Peacebuilding Architecture Review every 5 years to take stock of how this architecture is performing, where there are opportunities to learn and improve the functioning of the UN's peacebuilding engagement. And the most recent Peacebuilding Architecture Review, or PBAR, in 2025 resulted in what are called the twin resolutions, which were adopted unanimously by both the Security Council and the General Assembly. So this signifies that there was large, wide member state agreement about, first of all, the importance of peacebuilding, and second of all, the recommendations that came out of it, which included the creation of the UN Peacebuilding Week as an annual structure, more than a conference, but more of a platform, which gives the United Nations and its partners an opportunity to take stock of how the UN is engaging in the area of peacebuilding through the different mechanisms that Erica mentioned, and how well it's partnering with member states, with the civil society, with other actors in the area of finance, around investment and engagement in peace building. So it was decided that this is a key moment at the 20th anniversary, both to reflect on what has been learned over these past 20 years about UN peacebuilding engagement, and there will be some spotlights in the course of this week that look at the impact that the United Nations and its partners have had. It also represents an opportunity to look forward. It's a very particular time at this moment with strong geopolitical shifts taking place, a dramatic reduction in resources for overseas development aid in general and for peacebuilding in particular. And so Peacebuilding Week offers this opportunity to gather all of these stakeholders together and to look into the future and to say, what do we need to be doing from this step forward? How can we partner differently, better, more effectively to have stronger investment in peace and stronger impacts at the level of communities and nations?
To both of you, there is this recurring criticism that we create too many forums. Normally these forums are convened in some of the wealthiest places on earth. Do you think this distracts us from actually going down the ground where conflict is happening, and actually untangle locally what is happening? Erica first.
One of the goals of those that have been involved in organizing this Peacebuilding Week has been exactly to try to bring some of those local voices. So actually one of the events that we're involved in sponsoring is on local peacebuilding and local mediation. And we have those who are actually involved in the ground from 4 different locations, so bringing local mediators and peace builders to it. There are also parallel events that are happening around the world throughout this week and in the coming month that are going to hopefully be taking forward some of these messages. So I think that's part of that bridge. But to your point on whether it's a distraction, I think part of what's Peacebuilding Week, what it's responding to are, as Sara mentioned, these challenges that we're seeing at the top level in New York in terms of questioning the commitment to multilateralism, questioning whether we are able to put up the same funds as possible. And so this event is really trying to solidify that commitment here so that that peace building work on the ground can continue to go forward.
And then, Sara, if you can come in. Now we have this Peacebuilding Week. How do we make sure that the agreements that have been reached actually are implemented on the ground?
Very good question. So there are a number of mechanisms in place and in development which are aimed at strengthening the policy to implementation links. One of those is the fairly new in the last few years CSO-UN dialogue mechanism, which was also created recently to strengthen this connection between higher level policy decision-making spaces and those who are working in communities on the ground, in the field, with the populations that are most concerned. So the CSO-UN dialogue is a standing structure which brings representatives of CSO, civil society organization networks, together to make recommendations from their field experience to be taken up into policy discussions and implementation priorities by the UN. The CSO-UN Dialogue Core Group is here this week and will be having a special event during the week where they present the results of their work. In the meantime, as well, within the headquarters of the UN, there are stronger uptake mechanisms to work throughout the calendar year on actualizing the recommendations made by the CSO UN Dialogue gatherings. So this is an important way to implement both on the UN side and in regions and national communities some of these key priorities and decisions that are made. Another is the emphasis being placed now on the development of national prevention strategies, which engages the UN's relationship with national governments. One of the core messages coming out of the recent PBAR resolutions is that to be effective, peacebuilding has to be nationally owned. It has to be locally led, and it can be and benefits from international support. So the priority now is on creating spaces where national governments lead the way, national prevention strategies, 3 of which will be highlighted as good practice examples this week from Papua New Guinea, Kenya, and Mauritania, offer opportunities for learning for other member states who want to adopt a similar approach. And that's also one of these key mechanisms for translating policy decisions into concrete action on the ground.
Erica, I know this is a difficult question. If there is one message, I'm sure there are many messages that will have to come out of the Peacebuilding Week. If there is one message that you would like to come out of the Peacebuilding Week, what would this be?
I think it's that peace building is possible, but you have to invest in it. This week will highlight a number of practical tools, partnerships, as you mentioned, from those that are working on the ground to those that are working here in New York, but you have to continue to support them and you have to invest in them. It's not enough to simply say, well, we'd like to prioritize peace and security, we'd like to prioritize doing conflict resolution. You have to do the follow through, and that's what Peacebuilding is all about.
Well, but Sara, we are living in a world that is increasingly complex, with challenges that are even becoming much more complicated, from conflict, displacement, to climate-related pressures, economic shocks. How does peace building need to evolve in such an environment so that it can be able to meet the challenges that we confront?
This is the core question, really, because a few things have been taking place. Number one, there's less of an appetite to support complex peace operations. These very large UN-led peace operations mandates are in decline. And that's also coming back to the point of the importance of nationally led initiatives in peace building. It's recognized that member states have to be the key drivers of peace building in their own territories, and to collaborate with local and international partners in the ways that are most effective. It's also true that there are new and multi-layered conflict risks. As you mentioned, increasing climate pressures, economic pressures, pressures of new technologies. New technologies in particular offer potential benefits also for peace building. And so the United Nations and other peace building actors need to dive deeply into these emerging risks and opportunities to deepen science policy work, evidence-based policy making around issues like climate, like technology, AI governance in particular, but also to change the way that the institution has been working, again, moving away from a headquarters-focused approach to locally led approaches. And that requires that we engage in more than a tick box manner key peace-building actors. And who are they? They are women, they are young people, they are community elders, they are civil society organizations, they are regional organizations that have their fingers on the pulse of what is moving and challenging communities on a day-to-day basis. So the UN is also facing this opportunity and challenge to adapt itself away from its established modes of operating into these new areas of engagement and into these new modes of operation.
Well, I would just have to follow up with you again, Sara. You raised the issue of new technologies and the benefits. Are there great risks of new technologies? In fact, there is a good body of work that is advocating that this is another vector of conflict, especially when it falls under non-state actors with their own objectives. What do you say about that?
The United Nations Peacebuilding and Peace Support Office has a peace tech work stream, which is specifically looking at the question, the opportunities and the risks of new technologies, not in an attempt to lead per se on the development of these topics, but to engage with other experts and organizations that are specifically looking at AI governance, at the uses and abuses of digital and AI technologies, and understanding what is the particular benefit that can also be brought through leveraging these technologies for peace building at the global, regional, and national, even local levels. In that regard as well, there is engagement by the UN in global AI governance summits, one of which is coming up here in July, another which I think is already taking place today here in New York. And is this definitely an area that's going to need close engagement and the development of global standards, regulation mechanisms, and also finding creative ways to leverage these new technologies for positive peace-building outcomes.
But if I might actually add something onto that as well, just as a concrete example of how does peace building address something like changing dynamics surrounding non-state armed groups getting new technology, these new AI threats? You know, I recently read a statistic that the number of non-state armed groups that have UAVs, that have drones, has jumped 800% in the last 4 years alone. So dramatic decline. But when you think about what is the response to that, often it comes at local communities. It comes at the sort of borderland communities that are part of these supply chains, which are often going through informal nodes and things like that. And so the ones that are actually working on the ground that would actually have a response to that, it's not a high digital finance here in New York, it's those local peace building actors on the ground who know who those actors are and can connect them to what they might be doing at local communities. And that's what this broader architecture of both UN agencies, but much more broadly communities, national governments, all of these different actors you're trying to do.
And maybe just to follow up on that point, Rita, the people who are developing these technologies are normally not part of our ecosystem. And we are not too sure whether they even know our values. In fact, the last time I was in Silicon Valley, none of the people had read the UN Charter. None of them had, the ones that had read, they never read the Declaration of Human Rights. Do you think this complicates the problem?
It complicates it, but it also brings new resources and avenues for working on these issues. So we worked last year with the Peacebuilding Support Office, key part of the Peacebuilding Architecture, on a thematic review of their programming. One of the core areas was hate speech and counter misinformation and disinformation. And across looking at the programming that they were supporting, a lot of the partners were not your traditional peace-building folks. They were private sector actors, they were YouTube, they were Meta, they were these new emerging AI innovation hubs who are often developing their own standards and rules in cooperation with others. So while that one tech person might have read the UN Charter, many of them are aware of the issue, they're aware of how it affects their operations and their profile, and there are ways to constructively engage all of the different actors that are part of this whole ecosystem of emerging technology in a way that can start to address some of the linkages with conflict.
What we find is that it is much more difficult to regulate technologies within the military industrial complex compared to regulating technologies within the social media space, for example. A good example is missile autonomous weapons. How difficult it is to actually agree on what needs to be done. How do we proceed?
I think what you're getting at is not just whether it's more difficult in sort of weapons produced by the military industrial complex as opposed to AI and social media, but the challenge of getting all the states to agree on taking those regulatory steps when there might be advantages or they might see interest in developing those weapons. This doesn't mean that you sort of abandon the tools that we've traditionally used to try to address threats to peace and security or disarmament. So for example, this challenge of lethal autonomous weapons, that's been on the agenda of major disarmament conventions and treaty bodies like the Convention on Conventional Weapons since the early 2000s. You know, diplomacy is slow. Getting states to agree to give up weapons that they think are an advantage to them is a long process, but this continues to be an important part of why you need these multilateral treaties, why you need these conversations to happen within the UN, but also these broader processes. It's sort of an argument for reinforcing some of these mechanisms rather than saying the technology has outpaced it and we can't use these forums anymore to contain these threats.
But these technologies are developed behind the veil. We might call it confidential, we might call it high security. Is it possible to regulate something that is behind the veil and is not in the public eye?
I mean, really, this is the history of military technology. This is old wine in new bottles. What about the early development of nuclear weapons, about any of these major military advancements was not initially developed under close wraps, under secret ones? This is part of actually why you need to have these conversations, you need to have these mechanisms, and you need to have them happening on a broader multilateral platform with the pressure of the international community behind them. This is the best way to try to get illicit cooperation. If everything is just staying behind closed doors and there's not even a conversation about the potential consequences, not only for your immediate neighbors, but for the broader community, there's no way really to nudge that. There's no way to create pressure on it.
Now, this year we are going to have an election for the new Secretary General. And of course we know that every Secretary General has his or her own agenda and priorities. Of course, we are not sure how much the issues of peacebuilding are going to be part of the SG's, the new SG's agenda. What are your expectations and what do you see in Tafest?
So everyone here in New York has definitely been focused on the new Secretary General elections. There's been a number of public statements and opportunities for member states to question the candidates. So far, many of them have really expressed an interest in key peace and security issues, the bread and butter of the United Nations, but they've often focused on peacemaking, on getting to a deal, maybe reflecting some broader trends within our global community. But I think bringing it back to Peacebuilding Week, what we've learned from the past 20 years of peacebuilding is it's not enough just to get to that deal. You then have to do the hard work of addressing conflict drivers, of transforming the underlying conflict dynamics, and that's where peacebuilding comes in. So I think whoever the next Secretary General is, whoever he or she may be, are going to have to really learn what is out there within the UN architecture and among other partners, and how to leverage that critical peace-building space to get beyond just getting to a deal.
From what we have observed, many of the candidates, and I'm going to direct this to Sara, many of the candidates are from Latin America. Do you think the geography of a Secretary General has any bearing on the issues of peace building?
Personally, I don't think that the geography is the key issue. I think it's more about how any one of the candidates understands what are peace-building priorities. And that will be inflected by their experience from their own communities and countries of origin. It will be inflected by their engagement with the UN system in the different functions that they've held, and from the different perspectives that they've brought to bear, whether that's from a human rights perspective or from a women's development perspective, or whether that's from the atomic agency perspective, or whether that's from an economic perspective. The key issue for the next Secretary General is to find out, to lead the way on how to do more with less in a very critical time in multilateral affairs and in global geopolitical conflict. We've got crises multiplying on multiple fronts. We've got economic shocks. We've got climate threats taking place. The next Secretary General needs to be able to understand the links between these different conflict drivers, to understand how they affect one another, and to have a coherent strategy for addressing all of them simultaneously, and engaging partners at all levels of society to cooperate on making significant change together. And so part of that challenge is strengthening commitment, recommitment to the multilateral system, as Erica was saying, getting member states back on board with the multilateral project. We're seeing a fragmentation in international diplomacy at the moment. We're seeing a fragmentation in alliances, looking more at national and regional interests over global multilateral cooperation. This is core. The other element to take into consideration is the different parts of the UN ecosystem itself. There are specialized agencies, there are satellite agencies and actors around these key concerns in different parts of the world, and we need to find also ways to get them to cooperate more effectively together. The recent UN 80 reform initiatives, the PBAR resolutions themselves have all been pointing towards getting the UN ecosystem to work more effectively for achieving common purposes. So the next Secretary General, again, whoever he or she may be, will need to lead on these topics and consolidate greater support from other members of the House and from member states above all.
Well, you raise a very important issue of the calculus of peace building. I'm going to ask Erica first. How can you do more with less if the world is becoming increasingly complicated, our ability to understand and treat it is becoming even much more difficult? Maybe help me to understand. Can you do more with less and get peace?
I think the question is not, can you do more with less? Indeed, you probably will do less with less. But are there ways that we can try to leverage the partnerships that have been built over the last 20 plus years the cooperative mechanisms that we've established, this architecture that's been built, try to use that in combination with local capacities, with national governments, with their own efforts that are happening by communities that also want to find solutions to conflict. Can we use that more effectively to try to address all of these disparate conflict drivers? It doesn't mean, though, that it will take no inputs. And this is one thing that I hope that a lot of the member states walk away from this Peacebuilding Week with, is that we have developed different toolkits, different approaches that do work in terms of developing those infrastructures for peace, and we shouldn't abandon those at the same time that we may be looking for ways to economize and take advantage of other cooperative mechanisms.
May I offer a positive example on this? So in the Peacebuilding and Peace Support Office, another new development which has been given a great amount of importance is the creation of a Peacebuilding Impact Hub for us to learn what makes peacebuilding effective. How do we best leverage partnerships, finance, programs, local and national actors in order to have real and sustained impact? And during this inaugural Peacebuilding Week, on the final day, there will be the launch of the first Peacebuilding Impact Country Spotlight, which takes a deep dive in looking at how the UN Peacebuilding architecture and its partners have had a concrete positive impact. The spotlight will be on the Gambia, and in particular around its experience with a sustained engagement in transitional justice after coming out of conflict. So this is one example of where we'll be able to see these different dimensions of cooperation having a positive impact in the field. And there's much to be learned from this example.
And how has the United Nations been involved in this peacebuilding conversations?
So UN University, particularly our Center for Policy Research with our New York and our Geneva offices, have been very involved in the peacebuilding conversations. So my part of UNU-CPR here within New York has worked with the Peacebuilding Support Office for the last 4 years, working on a number of thematic reviews and other studies of how the Peacebuilding Fund has actually been able to create impact in different areas of peacebuilding priorities, whether that's on climate and natural resources and how that affects conflict, or as I mentioned, hate speech or misinformation. Both of our offices were also heavily involved in last year's conversations on the Peacebuilding Architecture Review, which is the process that led to the Peacebuilding Week that we're here on, including engaging on a number of the proposals that went before member states, the General Assembly and the Security Council, leading up to their twin resolutions. But I think more broadly, UN University and all of its research centers have the ability to contribute to this conversation through their research, through spotlighting what are the changing dynamics in this global system. Some of them have a specific conflict focus, some of them may be focused more on technology or other economic factors, but all of them play into better understanding how can peacebuilding tools respond.
And Sara, would you like to add to that?
Well, the UNU-CPR office in Geneva has contributed also in substantive ways to the UN's engagement in peacebuilding and to Peacebuilding Week. Again, along the same lines, UNU-CPR in Geneva has, in the last couple of years, contributed significant research around the role of, for example, human rights data as a key source for early risk analysis and conflict prevention engagement. So strengthening the relationship between human rights and peacebuilding. Other research has been done around climate, peace and security and the importance of engaging with climate issues when we're looking also at the dynamics of drivers of conflict and necessary foundations for peacebuilding. And this year, a liaison officer, myself, a liaison function was established between PBPSO in New York and Geneva with the aim of strengthening the New York-Geneva relationships in order to leverage, on the one hand, the rich ecosystem of peacebuilding expertise in Geneva as a key resource, a key asset within the wider peacebuilding ecosystem that can be put to better use, perhaps, at the country level. as well, and in global policy dialogues, and also bringing more awareness around the UN's engagement, also to that ecosystem, as Erica said, engaging the Geneva ecosystem as well in contributing to the PBAR reflection process and in operationalizing the resolutions that came out of it. So there's a strong inter-ecosystem relationship that's taking shape, which is also part of how UNU-CPR is playing a facilitating role.
Erica, is peace building about member state action, or is there a role for the research community we belong to? What might be our contributions in the evolving peacebuilding architecture?
So I think as the events this week will highlight, it is about member states. It is about their commitments to peace building. It is about their national ownership within their own countries. But there's also a number of events that are specifically spotlighting the role of academia, the role of research institutions, the role of civil society, what their contributions are in terms of understanding conflict systems, but also opportunities for peace. We've talked about a couple of the emerging issues that are real challenges right now for peace builders, whether it's emerging technologies or climate shocks or other economic ones. And this is where research institutions like ours or other academic institutions can really contribute in terms of understanding these evolving systems and threats and better positioning the system as a whole, including member states, in responding to them.
Well, I have one last question. It's a controversial one. There is a recurring criticism that the United Nations is absent from major conflicts. Whether it is in the negotiation that we are seeing right now in Iran, whether it is in the untangling of the situation in Gaza, whether it is in Ukraine, you can name the conversation. I think this is a fair criticism. And what are some of the elements that the United Nations will have to pursue so that it can become core to some of the negotiations that are going on?
I think this is a common critique that the UN is absent from this. First, I think it's important to understand that there are different facets. What do we mean by the UN? So some people may say they were absent, but when the outbreak happened with conflict in and around Iran, it was member states here at the General Assembly, at the Security Council, in those member state-led parts of the UN. This became the primary forum for trying to negotiate some of those issues, then going into bilateral conversations. Let's take another level, which is the sort of technical work that happens on the ground in many of these conflicts. The UN is certainly not absent from Gaza. Many of the life-saving support, but also some of the lower level engagement is happening and being led by both UN humanitarian agencies, but also by the range of humanitarian and peace operations that are studied around the region. Take another conflict like Sudan. We have UN actors who are on the ground working with local communities who are the ones that are brokering ceasefires amidst a really difficult to resolve conflict. So the UN is in all of these spaces, but I do agree with you that in some of these larger challenges, there is a need to create more space for the UN to really bring the different tools and mechanisms that it has to bear to be able to offer that neutral convening space and also to leverage all of these technical capacities that they have in these countries to really bring some of these conflicts to an end.
So, Sara, we are seeing a lot of investment into the militarization of states and less investments into peacebuilding. Do you think this is a fair assessment, and what can be done about it?
Absolutely. This is a key concern and one of the main topics of Peacebuilding Week, in fact.
Across the board, investment in peacebuilding has dropped significantly. With the ongoing and increasing conflicts around the world, we're seeing member states diverting funds to increased military spending and to humanitarian crisis management. And as important as these are, there's no end to that spending until we resolve the question that underlies both of them, which is the need to prevent and decrease conflict and to strengthen global stability and sustainable peace. And the engagement of the UN, but also of the UN's partners in peace building, is being threatened by this drop in investment. And one of the key messages and one of the key topics that is going to be explored throughout the week is how can we think differently around financing for peace? Where else should we be looking for financial partnerships that we haven't been giving priority to until now, because there was a fairly agreed system of multilateral investment in the UN Peacebuilding agenda. So across the week, there's going to be several sessions that look at new and innovative financing models, new financial partnerships with the private sector, and also looking at what can the UN and its partners do to promote peace-supporting economies in the wider sense. There are many important gains to be made by engaging the business community, by engaging the private sector, to think in terms of what is their peace-building contribution, and are they inadvertently contributing to conflict dynamics, and what can be done to reorient economic policies to address some of the key drivers of intergroup grievance and of conflict on the ground. So investing in peace is one of the key points to be explored during this week, and one of the key outcomes that Peacebuilding Week hopes to make progress on.
And if we just look at the numbers themselves, it's about $2.8 trillion investment into militarization currently globally, which is over 10 times investment into development. And do you think we will ever close the gap?
It's a challenge making sure that that message gets across to all of the member states and financial partners. But it's absolutely essential. I'll give you an anecdote. So I was in South Sudan in February this year, doing research related to some of these peace-building challenges. And I went to some communities that were in northern part of South Sudan on the border with Sudan. And the message that I had gotten before I went in, I spoke to one of the prominent donor countries, and they were saying, we don't think there's any possibility for peace building in the current environment here. We're just going to focus on humanitarian aid. But I went up to those areas that are experiencing the height of the spillover effects from Sudan, as well as their own sort of spreading internal civil conflict. And you look at the landscape there, and if all that we can do is humanitarian aid, there is no bottom, there is no end to that conflict there. You have to find a political solution, you have to find a peace-building solution. And so getting that message across, not just to member states, but as you point out, to these broader private sector economic communities that are also part of this broader picture, I think it is an essential part of the messaging for this week.
Thank you very much, Elika. Thank you very much, Sara. We have come to the end of the conversation, but the work still goes on. Peace is very important. It's also delicate. And if we do not invest in it, we are investing into conflicts. Thank you.